Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to give it still 1-2 minutes to see so that everyone can join the webinar. Thank you. Hello, hello. I think we can already start probably as people are joining in. So hello, everyone. Very nice to have you here. I hope you can hear us all well today. We're very happy to have you and the amazing panel of speakers here with us today. My name is Alexandra Gerasimcikova. I'm head of policy and advocacy at Counterbalance, which is a network of NGOs based in Brussels, and we work on reforming European public finance, looking predominantly at the European Investment Bank. We're organizing today this webinar as a coalition of NGOs called Citizens Observatory for Green Deal Financing. Here, our speaker, Francesca, is also part of this observatory. We're here to discuss today the European Green Public Finance Agenda. Now, it has been 4 years since the announcement of the European Green Deal, and we are midway into the implementation of the recovery funds. At the same time, we're also seeing now the comeback of the austerity rules, and we'll have European elections very soon. So it's a really good and important time for us today to discuss what kind of green public investments agenda we need, we imagine, and what's the future of the financing instruments such as the Next Generation EU and the MFF in the future, and how that can deliver on the Green Deal for the citizens. In this webinar, we would like today to launch and present our new report, Beyond Profit, How to Reshape European Green Deal for People's Well-Being, which was prepared by this coalition of NGOs called Citizens Observatory for Green Deal Financing. Just briefly, maybe to introduce the report. I mean, the speakers will go in depth on that, but just to say that generally we look in this report at the implementation of the European Green Deal so far, and at the key European financing programs that actually deliver on the Green Deal, such as Recovery Resilience Facility, InvestEU, and the public sector loan facility implemented by the European Investment Bank. So the report argues that despite very strong ambitions and the potential that the Green Deal introduced, there is of course significant shortcomings with regard to some of the priorities, the design of the funding programs, etc., that are still lacking or like falling behind in the Green Deal. Our speakers will dive a bit more into the details about the Green Deal's focus on competitiveness and large infrastructure programs, and discuss how much better we can actually imagine a Green Deal that works both for the environment and the people. Today we have with us amazing panel of speakers. We have Philippe Lambert, who is a member of the European Parliament and co-president of the Green Group. We have Francesca Canali, who's public finance campaign coordinator at ReCommon. We have Frank Vanaerschot, who is a director of Counterbalance. And we have Edith Lakatos, who is senior policy officer at Housing Europe. Thank you everyone for joining today, this discussion. Just briefly, like a few housekeeping rules. The format of this discussion will be in the form of questions and answers. First, I will pose a couple of questions to the speakers, and then we'll open the floor for all the participants in the final 15 to 20 minutes, depending how the conversation goes. As usual, you can ask your questions in the Q&A box below or in the chat. I think that's the main functions. I think there's also a way how to unmute a participant and let the floor in. So you're very welcome to try it. I hope my colleagues will help me because I'm not sure how to do it, but I'm sure we'll manage that. So Francesca, let me first turn to you. The report you also worked on, it argues that the recovery funds are so far slow on the implementation and that many of the projects that actually get financed are not even really sustainable so far. So can you tell us a little bit about what kind of projects and what kind of implementation are you talking about? And for example, looking at Italy as a case study, and why has the rollout been quite slow so far?
Thank you, Alex, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Francesca Canali. I'm representing today ReCommon, where I coordinate the public finance campaign that since yesterday has its own name. It's called MIRA Network. And I would like, first of all, to say that I will highlight the Italian case. You can find many more examples in the report, but I will try to touch upon also other cases that were presented by my colleagues in the report. So for the Italian case, as outlined in the report, the implementation is slow. In the Italian case, 34%, according to the scoreboard, 34% of the milestones and targets that are part of the Italian recovery plan are delayed. And actually, the percentage gets worse when it comes to the green pillar. Here, the percentage is only 33% of the milestones and targets have been achieved. This is also confirmed by Italian data. According to the data that was released in December by the Parliamentary Budget Office, Ufficio Parlamentare di Bilancio, we're talking about 75% of the projects being delayed. Of course, these numbers are particularly concerning in the Italian case because, first of all, delayed implementation risks undermining the achievement of the several targets and milestones. And regarding the green pillar, in the Italian case, we definitely need the money of the recovery fund to implement ambitious policies related to climate, energy, and biodiversity. We're talking about the largest beneficiary of the Recovery and Resilience Facility in Italy. And it's common to hear or read articles in the media, but also hear opinions by people in civil society organizations, not only in Brussels, but also in Italy, saying how the overall success of the Recovery and Resilience Facility depends on the success of the Italian case. Of course, to reply to your question, the slow implementation is depending on several different factors. Of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent rise in inflation is the main factor why the implementation is rather slow. However, as I said before, these risks undermining the achievement of very important measures that were included in the plan. You mentioned, Alex, before how there are investments that are not in line with the green transition, and I will be briefly mentioning that a bit later. But just to say that there are also very good measures that were included in the Italian recovery plan, such as, for instance, the support to energy communities, which is affected by several delays. And of course, we see it as very problematic how we might not succeed the achievement of these target before the end of 2026. And I would like to point out the energy community case because this is part of the report also for Poland. The Polish case, this was included in the REPower EU chapter, so recently approved. And Poland is also facing several delays, which might undermine the achievement of these target. Just to say that for the not so in line with the green transition investments and projects that we are observing in the Italian case, I would like to focus on one specifically, which is the Sulmona case, which is part of the REPower EU chapter. It was actually included in the REPower EU chapter after being excluded from the initial version of the recovery plan. Why? Because it was later included in the REPower EU chapter as it's exempted from the do not significant harm principle. We're talking about the construction of a new gas pipeline from Sulmona, which is in central Italy, to Minerbio, which is in the northern part of the country, as part of the Adriatic pipeline. operated by SNAM, the Italian transmission system operator. And according to the Italian government, this is in line with the Repower EU plan objectives, meaning meeting immediate security of supply of energy. However, we have delved more into the investment itself. And in the report, we highlight how it will not actually serve the purpose claimed by the Italian government, but it would only serve the objective of exporting more gas to Central European countries. So just to say that we have more examples in the report. I've also included inside the report the Genoa case. So definitely not many investments that unfortunately are not in line with the green transition. I would like to conclude by saying that regarding the difficulties and the reasons why we see slow implementation. As I said before, officially, of course, what has happened in the past few years has contributed to many delays with regards to the implementation of the measures. But we also would like to say, and this is very well stressed in the report, that the reasons are also within the Recovery and Resilience Facility governance itself. We've been speaking to many regional authorities in Italy, and we've seen many issues regarding the capacity and the technical skills of the regional authorities to implement the investments and measures in the country.
Thanks a lot, Francesca. Very interesting to hear your findings of the report. Frank, let me turn to you now. In the report, you argue that there are many current political setbacks at the moment for the EU climate policy that are caused by the way the European Green Deal is being financed. You also say that one of the key problems is that it doesn't really pay attention to the solutions for people's needs. Could you elaborate on that? Like, what do you mean by that? And in your opinion, how well has the Green Deal been financing, social solutions so far, apart from the types of projects that Francesca, for example, mentions?
For this question, and welcome to everybody. We are happy to present this report on which we've been working with some of us and others that are in the audience for quite some time, and we're happy to launch this today. Let me first of all say that we should not forget that the European Green Deal itself and also the Recovery Fund, that it's very good that this came. Before, like if you say like 10 years ago, it was science fiction to have such that agenda high on the agenda, climate high on the agenda, and big public investment programs, be it on national or on European level. But the question remains that the most important thing to look at is what we are doing, does it meet the needs that we have today? And then we have to say, no, there are really important shortcomings. There are setbacks that we are facing in more recent times. But what we argue is that there are also issues with the way these programs were set up, with the strategy behind it. And this is what we want to talk about a little bit, that I paid a lot of attention to in the report. And where we said, like, if you look at we have the Recovery Fund, but the other mechanisms that finance the Green Deal, it's a lot using of public budget from the EU to give guarantees for public investments, which are made by the European Investment Bank or other public investment banks to finance projects. And what we see, there's two real things that we see very important, is that one of them is there's a really big focus on trying to use, in the end, quite small amount of public money to attract private investors. And as such, to work with private investors doesn't have to be a problem. Like, of course, there are a lot of private companies, there's a lot of private money. They should all contribute to the fight against climate change. But what we say is difficult with this strategy is that actually by working like this, is that you actually rely on what a private investor wants. And that you actually, like you end up making projects where the goal always has to be that they have to be profitable enough for the private investors. And we say like, this is not, we cannot work like this. There are so many investments that need to happen for tackling climate change, which are not really profitable on the short term, which are not so interesting for many investors. That's what they say themselves. We need to have a strategy that we can really do the required investments, regardless of if the market finds them interesting enough. If the market doesn't want to do it, we have to change something about the market, not the other way around. And that we really need really big amounts of public investments, more than what we can do today. It's confirmed again by the report that the European Environmental Agency made yesterday. Another aspect that we really look at is that it's very focused on changing, making technological innovations for green technology. That's, of course, we need green technology, but it's not good enough if we are going to largely mimic the same type of economy that created climate change, but then with new technology. No, we have to do big transformations of what the economy looks like, and technological innovation is only part of this. And let me give you an example of one project that we looked at, which is very much looked at as a positive project. It's that in the end of last year, beginning this year, many public investors, including the European Investment Bank with support of InvestEU, gave billions of public money to Nordvolt, which is a Swedish company that makes a giga factory for batteries for electrical cars. And of course, we need this. We need the batteries for electrical green transport. But what you see is that if you look at, it's not really planned. There's not a really good vision of what kind of greening of transport is this factory a part of. We see, for example, that many of the clients of this company are the car companies that are now making, for the electrical cars that they make, they are mostly SUVs, which is only like a certain amount of population that can afford them, which doesn't look like a particularly helpful strategy if we want to green the whole mobility. And I use this example because I want to go to why, like, is there enough attention to the needs of people? In the report, we looked because we had the climate crisis, we had COVID and the recovery fund as response, but also the inflation and the cost of living crisis. And we see that there are some basic needs of people, such as housing, transport, energy, access to water and food, etc., which are really basic, and that if these prices rise a lot to have access to this really makes a difference if people fall in the poverty trap or not. And housing is one really important of them. That's also why we invited Edith today. And that all these sectors are also really important for tackling climate change. And what we say is a public investment, a climate strategy and the public investment strategies should really pay attention to decarbonizing these sectors, but in a way that you really put central that everybody can have access to the environmentally green solution. And the good thing is that when we were looking into some of the investments that were made by InvestEU, by the EIB, we also found really good projects of investments, cooperations between public investment banks with local authorities. There's somebody who's not muted, but okay, who invested in local public energy, transport, social housing, and renovation of social housing, but on a very small scale. For example, the Just Transition projects of the EIB as part of InvestEU, they were only 1% of all the InvestEU investments that were made. And so what we say is that the current approach, because as part of the European Green Deal, there is a part for just transition. There is the idea of slogan of leave no one behind, but it's really small in size, and it's focused only on zones, on areas that are designed, that are defined as areas that are really vulnerable because, for example, they depend a lot on coal mining or other economic sectors that have to really profoundly change to tackle climate change. And of course, we need to keep on doing this and with maybe much more, but we are in favor of a holistic approach where we look at the social impact of climate change and making sure people, especially from lower and middle income households, that we serve their needs, and that the technological changes that we are going to finance, or the companies that we're going to finance, that we make sure that these companies contribute to the provision of these public services.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. I mean, it's very interesting because the report also mentions, you know, that some of these programs have also some kind of social cohesion objectives. So clearly those are being also ignored to a large degree. Philippe, can I turn to you now? I don't know if you want to jump in with camera or without. Yeah, perfect. Hi, thank you. So you organized the Beyond Growth conference last year in the European Parliament. We attended it. It was very interesting. Many interesting discussions and also pretty radical compared to the mainstream at the moment on the EU level with regard to the Green Deal. So well done. And indeed, in the report as well that we are presenting, one of the criticisms about the European Green Deal is the fact that it's really focusing on the green version of growth and really offering rather the same status quo, just, you know, under a decarbonized version. Now, especially interesting and ahead of the elections is also to think about what do you think, in your opinion, are actually political obstacles to move beyond the situation that Frank was describing and come up with a climate agenda that is not only based on growth. Like, what are the things that prevent us from this type of publicly oriented Green Deal?
Well, I would say what prevents this is the how should I say, an overarching narrative that is accepted by the vast majority of policymakers, but also citizens, that growth means well-being. So if you speak about beyond growth, that means, well, people understand beyond well-being. If you speak about degrowth, people understand less well-being. Like it or not, that's exactly where we are today. By the way, when von der Leyen introduced the Beyond Growth conference, she said that indeed the fossil-based growth model is gone, is obsolete. I think this was her words, but actually the entire growth that we've seen is predicated on the use of fossil fuels. So she didn't go further, but when she introduced 4 years ago the European Green Deal, she presented it as our new growth strategy. And there you see how difficult it is already to keep a majority behind the European Green Deal. We just voted at noontime the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive and the Industrial Emissions Directive. We still had majorities, but they are getting narrower and narrower. So if you go with a frontal strategy saying, well, this is about moving beyond growth, you are certain to lose majorities. At the Beyond Growth conference, it was interesting. I think it was a panel precisely where we discussed the different narratives, you know, green growth, beyond growth, degrowth. And there was this economist from OECD, Jacobs, I think, who said, well, guys, for the next 20 years, it doesn't really make a difference, because in order to get to a society of sufficiency at the moment, we need to invest massively. And that those investments will generate economic activity. That's just fact. If you replace a fossil-based energy infrastructure by a renewables-based infrastructure, even if you take into account sufficiency, the installation and the production and the installation of all that kit will, of course, generate economic activity. So I would not advise a frontal strategy. I would just take them to their word, basically saying, okay, if we are serious about respecting planetary boundaries, you will soon discover that sufficiency is the key word, that always more doesn't work. Actually, we will need the sufficiency paradigm to seep in, but we are not there yet. I think we made inroads. At that conference, you could see that it was massively followed, of course, maybe not by policymakers, but actually it made an impact on policymakers too. But this is a cultural battle that is still being waged as we speak, and you see the backlash against European Green Deal at the moment. So again, don't use a frontal strategy. Let's just agree, and I think on that, you can have a broad agreement. Do we agree that what we need is to ensure a shared prosperity within planetary boundaries? And there, indeed, the far right will say no to that. But I would say that by and large, there will be in the mainstream parties an agreement that prosperity should be shared and not just for the happy few, and that indeed we need to respect planetary boundaries. If they are serious with that, then let's work on it, and we will soon discover indeed that we will need to talk, well, not just to talk, but to act on sufficiency. By the way, I just wanted to react to some stuff that was said before. Public investments needs will be massive. I can share with you let me do that immediately in the chat, the reference of the study that we commissioned from the Institut Rousseau. This is, I think, the most in-depth study about the incremental needs for investments for the next 25 years. And basically it says 2.6% of GDP additional investment, of which 2/3 should be public investment. That is just a minimal estimate of what is needed. Now, some economists will say, well, the distribution between public and private should not be 2/3 public and 1/3 private, but actually the fact is that many investments that should be private, and we just voted energy performance of buildings, well, many homeowners are simply financially incapable of funding the necessary works in their houses or apartments. So basically their capital is their dwelling, but they don't have extra capital to insulate it or replace the heating system. Therefore, without massive public support, you will not see the renovation wave that you need. And this is why, indeed, you will need massive public investments. Otherwise, it won't happen. Plus, as was mentioned before, some investments have no profitability, but have a societal profitability, but not a monetary profitability. And these, by definition, need to be funded by public investments. So if only for that, that's the way to go. And the problem is, of course, that the fiscal rules that are on the verge of being adopted in April are making that not economically impossible, but legally impossible.
Thanks a lot, Philippe. Some of these topics that you mentioned or the issues, they're also covered in the report. So I very much encourage everyone to read it and also engage with the work that our partners from the Citizens Observatory are carrying out in their capitals. Because indeed, it talks in detail about how some of these investments actually do leave people behind, right? As you mentioned, like the amount of capital that people have available for carrying out these types of projects, like it's a bit more tricky than just encouraging them to do it with some types of subsidies. Yeah. Edith, let me turn to you now. Speaking of sufficiency that was just mentioned, you know, and shared prosperity, the Beyond Profit report speaks also about public finance needs like affordable housing, which indeed is not necessarily, you know, commercially attractive solution for the private sector. From your experience, the way you have been watching the implementation of the European Green Deal, what kind of investments does it offer really for affordable or social housing at the moment? Is it nowhere near sufficient? How do you see it?
Thanks very much for the question. Thank you, Counterbalance, for inviting us. And yeah, it's a really interesting question that actually has different facades. We have been working on monitoring the different EU funding instruments for the sector in the last 15 years. And of course, there are a lot of initiatives that are going to the good direction. The problem is mostly with the scale. So well, we can enumerate also with the different funding instruments. We see in the last period of the cohesion policy, we saw 60 billion investments in our sector. There is also the Just Transition mechanism that is providing support. We don't know yet how many regions will use it for affordable housing, but it's available. We also see the InvestEU is slowly delivering some results. However, we are a little bit more critical about the InvestEU because in the beginning it was sold a little bit like the dream funding instrument, from the EU that is really needed for our sector because of the guarantee that it is providing for more riskier investments. But we see that out of the 16 billion that is put on the table under social infrastructure, only 365 million have been channeled in the sector, only for 3 projects, one in Belgium, one in Germany, and one in Spain. So there is still room for improvement, at least about this. However, on the other side, we see that the EIB and the Council of Europe Bank is working really hard to put money in the sector, and we see in the last 2 years we are seeing more than 4 billion investments in the sector, and also including new countries. This is also a new paradigm, I think, in the life of the EIB, that is trying to position itself as the bank of sustainable and green housing. So we see investments in new countries like Slovakia, Slovenia, or Czech Republic. And yes, Francesca already talked about the recovery plan that allocated a lot of money for social infrastructure. We saw more than 52 billion to be invested in the sector, and one of the biggest allocations in Spain, Portugal, and Italy. And we see also 10 countries putting important reforms in housing forward. So there are a lot of initiatives, just to mention also the Social Climate Fund that will put some part of the money for buildings. So we see at Housing Europe that we should really earmark funding for housing in this new Social Climate Fund. Otherwise, it will not happen. As was also mentioned by different speakers, the priorities will be defined by the member states by the end of the day, and it's a fear that they will not put the money towards social infrastructure. So earmarking would be an important step. And we also see that there is still lack of data of the investment gap, because of the last big report by Prodi in 2018 was launched on social infrastructure, which identified an investment gap of 57 billion per year in social infrastructure. And we estimate that this investment gap is increasing since the COVID crisis, the energy crisis. There is also a big inflation that is impacting our members' delivery of housing. As Francesca said, also they are really late with the implementation of the recovery plan. So we see that the different instruments are there from the EU, but the national governments should also step up their efforts, because the public investment has been cut year by year, even though there is a increasing investment gap in the sector. That would be the first part of my answer to the question.
Great. No, very, very interesting what you're saying. And of course, yeah, the renewed austerity, it's a big problem now as well. The fact that Next Generation EU will come to an end by 2026. On which note, I'd like to turn back to Francesca. In the report, you also advocate for continuation of this type of public funding, such as the recovery funds. But you also say that it should be reformed. Can you tell us a little bit about what kind of structural changes you think would be needed if we were to renew this kind of instrument, which of course is generally like a big political task, but it's something that we need to already start thinking now to ensure continuity of this type of finance, which is now needed more and more, not less and less.
Thank you again for the question. Indeed, in the report, the members of the observatory agree that Next Generation EU and therefore the Recovery and Resilience Facility is a big step forward for the European Union in terms of climate ambition, and the unprecedented amount of money that has been made available for the European member states is for sure represents a big opportunity for all member states. And talking about the Italian case, of course, going back to my previous point regarding Italy being the largest beneficiary of the Recovery and Resilience Facility, this becomes pretty clear. Therefore, we believe that Next Generation EU, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, should be continued, but also reformed. Before, in my previous response, I mentioned several issues that contribute to the delays in the implementation of the RRF, with particular reference to the Italian case. And I said that this does not only have to do with the events that have been happening in Europe for the past few years, but it's also very much linked with the issues in the governance. In the report, we outlined several points that could be strengthened and improved in the RRF 2.0. First, before I said that we are facing issues regarding the capacity and technical skills of the, for example, in the Italian case, regional authorities, but not only. I know this is common to the other member states mentioned in our report. So better implementation is key, but the implementing authorities have to be supported with that. And the missing link, that is, let's say, the missed chance of the current recovery and resilience facility implementation, is about the involvement of the public. It's about the involvement of the citizens and local communities. Talking about the Italian case, there has been very little involvement of civil society organization, not only to mention the citizens themselves. And this has caused several issues, because we see the civil society organization as a potential, as to be of great support for the implementing authorities, not only in the planning phase, but also, as I said, during the implementation of the funds. So ensuring more involvement of the public is one of the main goals of the Citizens Observatory that I am representing today, that has been working for the last couple of years on analyzing the situation in the countries. And we see very different situations. For example, we see in some member states monitoring committees. In the Italian case, we don't have a committee that has monitored the situation, that has been working together with the implementing authorities. So we see this as one of the points that should be part of the reform, although, as I said before, and I would like to restate it again, Next Generation EU was a big step forward, and to follow the discussion that has been the points that have been brought up by my colleagues here on the panel, the investment gap that we would see without RRF 2.0 is critical, and we need the funding, but we need good funding and good implementation of the funding.
Thanks a lot, Francesca. Frank, maybe now we talked a bit about the need, to involve citizens, etc., like in the design of the funding, but let's look a bit at the institutions we have at hand. At Counterbalance, you are working on reforming the EIB. So maybe from this hat that you have now, what do you think is the key problem? Why is the EIB and generally these types of Green Deal programs are still not financing enough public services? And what do you think are the ways to move on from this? How do we make sure that public services and the well-being of the people, etc., is financed more?
I'd like to frame this in the bigger discussion, is because I find it interesting, this report, Philippe, that you shared, and I would be really happy to see it. Also, these numbers on 2/3 of public investments, because we actually have to start from the picture where we are today. Is that what's on the agenda now? We will not have the necessary public investment capacity, and this needs to grow. We really need to grow this public investment capacity. And if I look at the EIB, which it's part of the equation, but it's only a part of it. What we see now is that you have actually a public bank, which has a business model which is doing some good things, but we think there is scope for a lot more. So as I already said before, as InvestEU or so, it's really focusing a lot on using the public investment capacity to make investments more profitable for private investors or other like private companies. working a lot together with investment banks, with investment funds, or big corporations that make a lot of profits already. And what we think that it could really do to do more is to use a lot more its balance sheet, all the money it has available, to give more loans, to take a bit more risk than it's actually doing, because it's a public bank. It has a non-profit mandate, as is described in the treaty of the EU, but it makes about 2.5 billion of profits a year. And we wanted to like increase the lending it does, but really focus on the public investments, the public services that it can deliver in these sectors that we were mentioning before, like housing, transport, energy. I'm forgetting one, but it's fine. And there to look at the projects where you can really be sure that all people, low income, middle income households, they will also have access. And this can be done because in many of these sectors there are projects that are maybe not directly profitable, but they have long-term economic viability. And this is exactly the place where a public bank like the EIB, together with other public banks and with the help of some support from the EU budget, where it can really increase its efforts. And I want to like focus again a bit on this issue of housing and link the financing aspect with the social rights aspect, because as Edith also said, like for many of or it was Philippe who said it, like many of the people, they don't have the capital to do this, and the programs that we see, as far as we know, that exist today to support people to renovate their housing, it's only touching like a certain amount until in the middle class. Beyond this, it's not really happening. And this means that climate targets cannot be met, because the renovation of all housing and buildings is part of what is needed to tackle climate change. But it also means that there is not enough, in the future, there will not be enough quality housing if this is not dealt with. So you're really on a point, on the nexus between climate policy that needs to happen, social, real important policy that needs to happen. Because when you lose access to housing, that's when you lose your decency and you really become a poor, or you become a homeless person, or you live in very bad conditions, as we see more and more happening in cities. And it's not a very profitable sector, so the market will not be doing this. So I gave the examples, and I think that there's a lot more scope of public cooperation, of which we see some examples, but we want to see much more in the future. And I think it's just one of the examples, the role of the EIB in a much larger public investment strategy that is needed, where we go, and that's why we have this title, we go beyond the profit. We're going to find the way to have public investment capacity, and the market is not our first concern. We have other needs that are much more pressing and that are really important for the well-being of people and for environmental protection.
Thanks, Frank. Directly following up on this also, to mention what kind of other solutions we can have, like how do we mobilize this type of necessary public finance for all these reforms. I'd like to turn to Philippe again. It's interesting now, ahead of the elections, again, political parties, political groups are coming up with different proposals. How do we actually get the money in to finance all these types of reforms? The Greens also have very interesting proposals, I think, and I see also now in the Q&A box, actually, there's a question from Melissa from Greenpeace International that also directly ties in with this, asking what role certain sources of redistribution, such as wealth taxes or climate legacy taxes, can have also in the financing. So, Philippe, what do you think? How do we get the money in for this type of public finance agenda for the green and social deal for Europe? Thank you.
Well, first, it is remarkable that not all political families have proposals for that. Many of them don't. Many of them don't. So at best, they want the European Green Deal to continue, but they are silent as to how they want to fund it. What you see mostly from the right wing is, well, it has to be private investment. But we know that indeed the so-called investors are actually in their vast majority rent seekers, not investors. What they want is the certainty of returns without taking any risk. And indeed, to some extent, as Frank was saying, what public finance institutions are doing is mitigating the risk for private investors. But why should we? If they want to deserve the name investor, well, they should take risks. The reality is that, as I said, 2/3 of the investments will need to be public. So there's only 3 ways by which you can fund public investments. First is taxation, and that's what Melissa is mentioning. It's interesting that an increasing number of even mainstream economists, I can mention Bruno Coleman in Belgium, Jean Pisani-Ferry in France, are basically saying without taxing wealth, we will never get there, never. So that is certainly, if you look at the global structure of taxation, those who should be the big taxpayers end up being very small taxpayers indeed. And that's basically big wealth and big companies, and the two are connected, of course. So without doing anything on that, you are doomed to fail. So that is absolutely crucial. And there, at the very least, the scale we need is European scale to avoid at least internecine competition between member states. So that's a must. But to tell you, the Eurogroup finance ministers meeting 2 weeks ago, I think, they concluded 2 things. Not only we should continue the regulation of the financial markets because we need a European capital markets union, but also they say, well, we should alleviate taxes on capital. Can you imagine that? So not only is capital pretty lowly taxed in Europe, but the finance ministers believe we should tax it even less. So taxation is a must-go area. And indeed, the European trading system for emissions trading system is a tax. There's no question about that. And it's good that we have it. But indeed, if you want a just transition, you will need to revisit quite fundamentally the whole taxation system, because otherwise you risk end up increasing the social divide. So not just revamping, but revisiting taxation in Europe fundamentally is a must. You cannot separate that from the European Green Deal. But the problem that we have there is that the competence is at member state level, not at European level. And you can see that the appetite for the European Green Deal at member state level is very low. So first aspect is taxation. Second aspect is changing spending patterns. That is cutting here to spend more there. But then, of course, you see where it goes. That means probably austerity for social security, for public services, which indeed, in terms of distributional effect, is again affecting, I would say, the lowest end of the income. Well, the lowest, well, I would say certainly the lower half of the income spectrum. Because, you know, when we speak about the most precarious, actually, precarity is, or precariousness is touching a significant chunk of the population. And so there's the third possibility, which is indeed borrowing. And there, I know that in some member states, borrowing is a dirty word, but actually, the European Union is at a debt to GDP ratio of about 90% on average. Well, in total, if you take the entire European Union, compared with 126% in the US and 263% in Japan, to take developed economies. So it's not that we've exhausted our borrowing capacities. And then if you ask people like Isabelle Coupet-Soubeyran in France, she will also mention monetary financing as a possibility for indeed public goods that actually have no profit potential. And indeed, that might be a fourth avenue worth pursuing. But so we should really look at that with no ideological barriers other than something that makes economic and ecological sense for society. But again, the appetite to have that discussion in the first place is very, very low. To be honest, I feel often quite isolated when I speak about that in the plenary or outside of the European Parliament.
Thanks a lot. Maybe just a very quick follow-up question, since you mentioned the joint borrowing also as one of the avenues. Do you think it's going to be possible to push that forward in the coming years?
Well, I think that when I mentioned borrowing, I didn't say joint borrowing, but indeed that is part of the solution. So, wet finger approach, we believe that the need for incremental public investment should be shared 50-50 between the member states and the European Union. And that means that for the European Union part, so we are talking about in total, the public part of the investment should be 1.6% of GDP. That would mean that half of it, 0.8 or something, would need to be done jointly at European level. And that would mean indeed a permanent RRF 2.0, fixing the problems that were mentioned earlier by the first speaker, because indeed RRF is good on paper, but when you look at the way it is really spent, it leaves to be desired. And there it should be 50-50. Now, you know, when RRF was adopted, the frugal member states said, this is only for once. It's a one-off. We will never, ever do it again. But actually, we will need to do it. We will need to do it. But again, I don't see a lot of appetite to discuss these matters during the campaign. What I see is a lot of sort of magical thinking. We will be able to help Ukraine and rearm. We will be able to fund the green transition. We will be able to keep well-being and all this by reducing taxes and not borrowing money. This is magical thinking. This is voodoo economics. But I'm afraid that many in the European power circles are actually adepts of voodoo economics.
We probably can agree on that together. Edith, I would turn to you for the last question, but just a reminder that afterwards we will turn to the Q&A. So if anyone has questions already in mind, please go ahead and write it down in the box below. I wanted to ask you, Edith, following up on what you also talked about earlier and some of the issues now with the financing for affordable social housing, what kind of investments would be needed now to actually cover existing needs? I mean, the question is also very much linked to what was discussed with regard to profitability, right? And like how much of it is profitable, how much of it is actually bankable or viable, because a lot of these investments are just not commercially interesting. Especially given the rising costs of reconstruction and general investors maybe not being so interested. So what's the future that you see in that? Thank you.
Yeah, so what we also put in our manifesto, I guess there are now 1,000 manifestos around Brussels, but what we put in ours is that we really need to change paradigm. And this is what we advocate for in the last 20 years. That we need a new housing paradigm, that actually the private market will not solve the whole issue. We need the national governments to step in, and we need national capital investment in housing affordability. So EU funding is just one piece that will help, for example, testing the new innovations, but scaling up the investments, it's really needed to have subsidies from the government. So we shouldn't, as you also said, Frank, we shouldn't forget that many of the activities are not profitable, and they are an investment in people's needs. So we need to change our approach and our paradigm and saying investing in social and affordable housing and investing in the long-term well-being of our people. So we really think that the member states should retain this ability to actively invest in the sector. And we also think that it means that they need to recognize the new realities. So when a person in Ireland, in Dublin, needs to pay €3,000 for rent, it is not sustainable anymore. So this is also what the new declaration is saying. If you are aware, the housing ministers met last week in Liège and agreed on a declaration. It's called the Liège Declaration Towards Affordable, Decent and Sustainable Housing for All. However, not all the member states signed it. I think it sends a strong message that they come together and then they send this message that it's important to step up investments. We also started working with the EIB because our feedback, the feedback from our members is also that the money is there on the table, but they cannot access it or they cannot use it as they wish to. For example, the loan from the EIB. And we started a work with EIB. We started a questionnaire on investment needs from local level. So, okay, what kind of investment needs they have in affordable and social housing, and how the different EIB products can tackle this, or how we should reform the different EIB products so it actually tackles the needs of the sector, because we see that it's not always easy. We see a lot of difficulty, for example, using the ELENA program for energy efficiency, so the project development assistance for energy efficient solutions. And we also have, of course, we need to go beyond finance. When we are talking about finance in terms of our sector, but I think when we talk about social infrastructure in general, we are talking about governance. The public banks will only invest in the sector when the governance part is all right. And EIB is saying this, repeating this all the time to the countries who don't have housing governance. Do your homework. So until there is no governance, no legislation, regulation on housing, there is no institution on housing finance, there are no housing associations, EIB will not put money, because there is a fear that the investment will not remain long-term and affordable and social. So that's why also we launched our working group on housing finance last year. And this is also how we started working with EIB to see how we can adapt the product so it's more usable for our sector. So this year we are going to organize the next meeting of this finance working group in Milano in November. And we try to also bring together the bankers with the project proposals and see, okay, why this project cannot be financed, how we could find an opportunity to get it financed. Is it a problem of scale? Is it a problem of governments, etc.? So this is the work we try to do. So for our sector, I would say that things go really beyond finance. That really goes to governance. And so just because we earmark some EU funding for housing, it will not change the game. It will not be a game changer. We need a new housing paradigm where national governments are taking this policy seriously and step up their capital investments.
Thanks a lot. It's very interesting. I don't know if you're also familiar, but there was also one of the EIB projects, for example, that the bank financed in Barcelona, about which we also heard that it was a nice project for affordable housing. But again, this requires collaboration also with municipalities, with different types of local authorities, because it's about pooling this type of finance. So indeed, what you say about this change of paradigm is so crucial, because we can't take it as a silo, like there's this program or that program or that program, but indeed it's like one complex architecture that we really need to focus on. Thanks a lot to all the speakers for your super interesting insights and very important conversations to be had. I see there is still one question in the Q&A that was not tackled. I will read it and then we can discuss it. I think it's mostly linked to what Frank was talking about, but if anyone wants to jump in, you're very welcome. Zoltan is mentioning implementation of the EU's battery strategy, so the electrification of mobility, that it can cause significant environmental problems on a local level. For example, through overuse of water resources and non-renewable energy sources. And he mentions specifically the National Battery Strategy of Hungary, which was implemented without prior strategic environmental assessment, which is interesting because actually the Hungarian battery plant is also mentioned in the report, I believe. And he's asking, how do you think the strategy can fit into the objectives of the EU Green Deal? In my view, battery strategy is nothing else but serving the car manufacturing sector without considering. So Frank, maybe, I don't know if you know specifics of the EU's battery strategy, but generally, maybe what do you think about this, this issue?
Yes, thank you. It's interesting that Zoltan was an invite. Comes back to this question because it's really one of the other, like there's really so many points where many issues come together, and these batteries, they're really one of them. And probably you, Zoltan, you know much better like the local environmental impact of batteries than I do. But in the cases that we looked at, so this Northvolt strategy, and also what we see more in general, we see these issues of the local pollution that is linked with them, but also in the supply chain, the mining activities that need to happen for to have the raw materials that are needed for these batteries. There are really a lot of issues with them, and then we really many of them, the mines for cobalt, coltan, other rare materials. They are most of them are in the global south. There's a big risk of a new form of exploitation, both on the social development and environmental level linked to this. And to bring it back, like what I think is really needed is that it's also going a bit beyond climate, and that we really look at, okay, the really environmental impact, the overall environmental impact, and we need to take this into account, and that an important goal, objective of this environmental strategy that we should have in Europe should look at that we limit resource use. And I think we will use some amount of batteries, and I'm not enough expert to know if to what extent it's possible or impossible to reduce the climate environmental impact of batteries as such in absolute ways, but we should do everything possible of any type of quantity of batteries that we're going to use to limit them. But here we also see it, link it with, like as Alex was saying, that the battery strategy is mostly just fitting to what the car industry itself wants to do, and this is clearly not a viable option. Like we have to green mobility, but this does not mean trying to replace just feeding the batteries for whatever cars that the auto industry thinks is profitable enough for them to produce. This needs to be based on a strategy. This is how we think that we can change the mobility and make it green and make it use the environmental limits that we have on the one side, and with these resources available, create as much as accessible transport for everybody possible. And these are the equations that we need to take into account, and that I think goes much beyond the current focus that we have now. In fact, there's like a really small point that I think it's really important, and for me it's a bit behind many of the things that we've been saying. I think it's us as civil society or people in government. I imagine that everybody who is assisting here today, that you take this issue at heart. It's really super important that we realize that this public investment, public support is really crucial for all actors involved, and that we see it as a really important lever that we as a population, that democratically we can use, but we have to mobilize around it really strongly, and that this public investment can also be used to change much more strongly the economy, and it requires a vision on the government to take a really more proactive role in the organization of economy and society, and I think we should embrace it with need for democratic control, of course, because I think that's really a kind of paradigm shift that we need to tackle the kind of issues that we're talking about today.
Thanks a lot, Frank. I would just highlight that Isadora also wrote an interesting comment in the Q&A section that regarding Northvolt, there's also now a critique in Sweden regarding this new green industrialization that is happening in the north, based on the same old colonial practices pushing back indigenous Sami groups. So just to say, stay tuned. We're also planning to organize a follow-up webinar on the topic, also discussing industrial policies. So we will dive into some of these topics a bit more in there. Frank, maybe one more quick question. Judith Clifton is asking if you would know of the best project of the EIB to look at with regard to just transition in Spain, in case you have that on top of your mind, or we can also share that afterwards. And Manuela Kropp is also posting a question: how can we deal with the narrative that debts will be burden to our grandchildren in this kind of context?
Should I start? Okay, Philippe needs to run, who could probably also provide an interesting answer to the grandchildren question. Well, I think for the project in Spain, we will have to look. I think that the housing project in Barcelona that Alex mentioned could be maybe one, but probably we have to look a bit more in detail. From the good examples that we found, I think there was one project in InvestEU in just transition between the Council of Europe Bank and social housing in Catalonia. Very fun. And maybe that's an interesting, it's mentioned somewhere in the report. Maybe that's an interesting one, but we would say to Judith that she contacts us and we can look at it. We'd be happy to look at it together. I think on the issue of the debts, I would say that, you know, like financial debts are social relations, which you can discuss about the depth of the resources that we use, or the CO2 budget, so the limited amount of CO2 or pollution that we can do without really going into runaway climate change. This is real. That's not something that you can deal with afterwards. The debts, etc. These are political arrangements in the end. This can be dealt with. In 2008, when banks were failing, we were able to liberate hundreds and thousands of billions of euros and dollars to make sure that these banks didn't fall, and many people came filthy rich out of it. We cannot, if we want to do this for climate change or a just transition, that's also possible. You need to have sensible debates of how you're going to mobilize this money. And I think Philippe said interesting things about different avenues of how we can mobilize the public investment, but these are in the end questions of public will and to what extent we're able to make powerful economic actors contribute to this change that we need. But if we are thinking about our debt children, it's the ecological debt that is the most important one, I think.
I think this will be a good moment to conclude this conversation with. In the chat, for everyone who's here, there are some very interesting links that were shared. We will also send it as a follow-up email together with the recording that we'll make available online, and a short summary of this event online as well. So thank you very much, everyone attending. Thank you, amazing speakers here today with us for this very interesting conversation. And as mentioned, stay tuned. We will definitely follow up on this type of engagement with you, hopefully very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks
Thank
a lot.
you. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.